ISA or infrasternal angle. We're going to talk about where it comes from, how it's discussed in the literature, how it's misrepresented, how you can measure it on yourself and others, and then what to do once you know which ISA you have. All of that today and more on this week's episode of
Welcome to Reconsider. I'm Bill Hartman. This is the podcast to challenge you to ask better questions, to look beyond traditional models of thinking and arrive at better health and fitness solutions.
Okay, so just get into it. A lot of people, I think, attribute the ISA model. They don't understand. We've had articles sent to us where people have talked about this model and have attributed it to Bill Hartman as the ISA model, which you've never said once.
No.
You've used the infrasternal angle as a way to show things, and you didn't invent it. It's something,
No.
It is a structure on the human body that people have paid attention to throughout the years. This is not the first time someone's looked at this thing and been like, hey, I wonder if I can interpret this in any way. So let's talk about your exposures to it early on, what it was used for back then, how you've adapted it to be a part of what you do with the Unified Health and Performance Continuum.
Yeah. So first exposure, 2001, maybe? Like Shirley Sarman talks about it in her movement disorders book. Not the same way that we do, but she does make reference to it, and she was using it to help identify certain relationships as far as like the musculature in the axial skeleton. And so that would probably be first exposure. And the way it was discussed, it was not weighted very heavily. And again, the way that she was using it was specific to her needs, which is fine. And then, fast forward 20, not 20 years yet, but, a bunch of years later, and starting to look closer at structure, looking at some of the older references and starting to see the connections as to how it could be useful. Because you can go back into, I think the oldest book that I actually own that would make any sort of, and it doesn't call it an infrasternal angle, body mechanics by Goldthwait. And I think 1934, it's 1934. And they were looking for ways to identify illness or people that were more likely to have problems, like mechanical problems or internal problems, differences in the shape of your stomach, differences in the position and shape of your heart, things like that. And they started to look at circumferential measures. And it was really cool the way they did this. They didn't have MRIs or anything cool like that, but they did have X-ray. So they took lead tape and they put it around people's thoraces so they get a circumferential shape, because the lead would show up on the X-ray. So they would take a superior to inferior X-ray to get a circumferential representation of a thorax. Then they took a whole bunch of these, and then they said, well, there's one that's kind of average, and then there's these two extremes. And then they identified them as the stocky and the slender. They didn't associate everything with that like we do, but they did start to look at the differences, and they said, hey, the more you get to this extreme, we start to see more problems associated with this stocky type, and then we also see problems with this slender type. So that starts to represent this concept of extremes away from some theoretical average. And then it comes down to what is our structural design, where we're helically structured. We have helical reinforcement of a cylinder shape. Then that points it towards there's a difference in our helical structure. Surely there's a way to represent this. And it turns out you see all of these helical representations that are repeating elements in anatomy, that there are similarities within those. Then you got a big one that just stares you in the face. And it turns out that the infrasternal angle is an excellent proxy measure for a foundational structural design element.
Okay. So I'm gonna stop you right there for a second, because I want to make sure we define what it is first. Mm-hmm. Just really simply, what is it? Mm-hmm. Yeah. What is it formed by? Why is that important?
Okay, so infra means below, and then sternal is your sternum. So below your sternum, the angle that's formed by the lower rib cage as it approximates its attachment towards the sternum. So this would be the lower rib. So think ribs 7, 8, 9, 10. These are not the ribs that are directly attached to the sternum, and so your attachment comes up and they attach to like the cartilage of the sixth rib.
Yeah, and
so
so
it makes this nice little inverted V or a triangular sort of shape. If it was flat, it's not flat, but if it was flat, it would be sort of like this triangular thing. And so then the ribs come up and they point right at your sternum, and so that's the angle that we're making reference to. Once again, we gotta distinguish the fact that it is on a cylinder, right? So it is a helical design.
About like a spiral sort of pattern.
1,000%.
Yeah,
and it spirals up a cylinder, like a bar.
And the importance of this being that cylinder can be slender or stout or whatever those old representations were, stocky and slender, and that will that will lead to having a slender or narrower angle or a wider and stockier angle.
Right.
And those would make up the two ends of a spectrum for the types of infrasternal angles.
Yes.
Okay. And that's what we'll get into next here is let's define the extremes as a way to teach this stuff.
So the way that we would distinguish those would be making reference to a wide or a narrow infrasternal angle. With that, then distinguishing an entire archetypes. So with the differences in the helical angle that would be associated with the infrasternal angle, you would have certain behaviors that would be associated directly with that. So there's certain movement-based strategies that are built into like how you would have to move based on certain elements, right? So if I have a helix that is on a more vertical axis, so we have a long axis that goes from head to tail, like we are constructed that way. So if you go all the way back into embryology, like literally everything comes off of a singular longitudinal axis. We are constructed around that. So we do have an axis, right? Which then provides us a frame of reference for the helix, right? So that's our vertical, and then that's how we measure the angle off of the long axis. And then so the closer I am to that vertical, then I have certain aspects of the way that I would be able to change that angle to a small degree, right? So we all move, right? So we all expand, we all compress based on our cylindrical shape. And then again, the angle of reference then determines what our capabilities would be as far as our ability to elongate towards the long axis and our ability to expand away from that long axis. And because of that, then there's certain ways that we actually have to move. We don't really have a choice in the matter. We have limitations based on the constraints of structure. And so when we always frame this based on the two extremes, so we can actually distinguish those qualities. And then, granted, there's a full spectrum of people, but if we, compare 8 billion people 2 by 2, we'll eventually find the narrowest of narrows, the widest of wides, and then there's going to be a variation on theme. But you will always bias yourself in one direction or another, just because of mechanical elements.
Okay, so we got two types. We've established where this idea comes from, what they originally were looking at, and then we're taking that information that you interpreted. They use these X-rays. They talk about certain body types. These are not the only studies and references in literature where they're talking about typing and structural archetypes. But you settled on these two extremes that seem to pop up and were very common.
Yes.
And then you start to look at it further and realize that there are specific behaviors and tendencies and biases for each. So let's get into that. What are the narrowest of narrows good at? What are the widest of wides good at? And how are those on different ends?
Yeah. Okay. So the narrowest of narrows, when we talk about the long axes, what they're really, really good at is actually squeezing themselves tighter around that long axis. So just imagine taking a towel, twisting it tighter and tighter and tighter. And what that does is it compresses the towel on the long axis. So they're really good at that. Problem with that is that if that is your structural tendency, then you tend to have difficulties doing the opposing strategy. So if I'm really good at squeezing myself tight on my long axes, I'm really good at squeezing myself. But the problem with that is that the tighter you squeeze yourself, the more difficult it is to move. And so then there has to be a way for you to move yourself away from that long axis to reestablish your capacity to move. And so if we look at the people that have the more vertical helical axes, those would be represented as our narrow helical archetypes. And because they can squeeze, they're better at squeezing. They actually have to bias their ability to breathe towards an inhale. Because what the inhalation does is it promotes the expansion away from the long axis and then actually gives them a space to move in. So imagine squeezing out all the space in your body directly onto the long axis. You can't move at all. If I expand away, I actually created a space for me to move. And so that becomes the now narrow helical archetypes breathing biases, that they have to breathe towards, they have to bias themselves towards inhalation all the time. And then that creates a bias towards, if we looked at the way that you would be able to move, is like you would be able to move slightly away from midline in that circumstance. Away from midline is actually external rotation. And so what we say is narrow ISAs are structurally, they compress, so the breathing bias is towards inhalation and their movement bias would be towards external rotation.
Right. And I think that becomes a confusing point for a lot of people because they're missing one of the starting points. They're skipping ahead to thinking that a narrow is an expanded representation that's always been expanded and has always had more range of motion. Correct. When it's really that the fundamental step of that structure is to squeeze toward the middle.
Absolutely. Without
so question. This is the first compensation strategy for that structure.
Yes,
is to expand.
Well, but think about it. If you didn't have a breathing bias towards inhalation, you would die.
You would die. You would get.
That is the extreme because if I squeeze all the air out of my body and I don't have a way to hold air in, then guess what?
Your structure would choke you out.
Absolutely.
You get choked out.
Yeah.
Before even starting.
There you go.
Yeah. So those. And then, let's before getting more into, let's kind of jump back and forth a little bit here for comparison's sake. We've talked about the narrows, structural bias, genetic bias. They're getting squeezed like the towel. They need to find a strategy immediately to expand, to breathe, to move. Yes. On the opposite end, we have the wides. So what is their immediate structural bias doing to them?
Okay, so look at them as the extreme opposite, right? So we still have a long axis, but their structural bias, their helical design actually biases them towards moving away from the long axis, right? So you could look at it as like either transverse axis or radial axis, which would be the perpendicular. So their bias is actually expanding away from this long axis. And so where the narrow helical archetype would squeeze itself, the wide helical archetype would actually compress itself on the vertical of the long axis. So it tries to spread itself out sideways. And in doing so, if I spread anything out sideways enough, I reduce the vertical dimension of this cylinder, if you will, to where it would expand into just like flat as a pancake. That would be the extreme representation, right? And nobody's going to do that, but that would be the structural bias. So their structural bias is towards expansion away from the long axis. Now, if I do this far enough, I can't move. It's just like squeezing it on the long axis. If I compress it on the perpendicular, I still can't move, right? Now, the expanded representation is the opposite of what the narrow helical archetype was doing. So that was squeezing all its air out. So now just imagine taking this indefinite inhalation. Right, so I'm going to expand away from the long axis indefinitely, right, until I can't move. And then guess what? It would be like taking the biggest breath in and never exhaling, right? So what they actually have to do to create a space is they have to exhale, bring their self towards the long axis, and now they create a space on where they can move, right? So their structural bias is towards expansion to the nth degree. So they actually have to squeeze. So what happens there is they then bias themselves towards having to maintain some measure of an exhalation bias in their breathing, which then biases their movement towards internal rotation. So at one end of the spectrum, you have the narrow helical archetype that would compress itself towards the long axis. They have to breathe in all the time to some degree. to some degree, right? To maintain the space for them to move, but that biases them towards external rotation. Wide would compress vertically as they expand sideways, so they have to squeeze inward, which is an exhalation bias, which biases them towards internal rotation.
Right. So it's really a matter of stimulus response, sort of. It's you're dealt a certain archetype structurally. If just left in and of itself by itself, a narrow structural archetype would just choke itself out and never make it. A wide structural archetype would just flatten like a pancake and just choke itself out that way and then never make it. So the response for the narrow structure is to expand. Yes. And the preliminary step is to expand, so that the things that the superpowers of each structural archetype really come from that first response of how do they have to adapt or compensate in order to move and live.
Absolutely.
So what you were saying is that the narrows, who are the twisted towel toward the midline, getting pulled long and twisted and compressed, try not to suffocate, their expansion bias created as that compensation allows them to move through space with a little less resistance, require external rotation in a far easier manner.
Yes.
But still have a pretty small base of support based on the slender structure.
Correct.
And then the wides have to, in response to their structural archetype, they have to internally rotate, kind of reclaim that space, that internal rotation space, which then allows them to generate force and put force down into the ground. But they still will have a larger base of support just based on the structural starting point.
Correct.
Okay. So I think we've sort of, because it becomes confusing when it's, okay, well, what's the preliminary structure? What is the narrow structure preliminarily cause? And it's not expansion. It's actually compression.
No. Correct.
I think that's a difficult thing for people to understand. It becomes confusing, but it's this expansive capability is a result of something else. 1,000%. It's a result of the structure. This compressive capability is a result.
Yes.
And then on top of that, you have gravity and movement and all of these things that are going to affect that structure. But these are your starting points for these given archetypes, right? So let's expand a little bit. Let's go back to narrows.
Pun.
Yeah, let's expand a little bit on the narrow structural archetype. And in terms of their movement biases and compensations and superpowers and Achilles heels, or their negative consequences.
Well, I mean, I don't know if they're negative consequences. We just have to understand what you're good at and what you're not good at, right?
So, let's just say that then.
Yeah. So if we define superpowers, an inhalation bias. So trying to maintain an inhalation bias takes away certain elements. It reduces your capacity to produce force, which is going to be an exhalation internal rotation bias. So we'll cast that aside. We'll leave that for the wide folk. But generally speaking, it's like all you have to do is put 200 kilograms in your back, perform a nice deep squat as you inhale, and keep inhaling, and then try to push back upwards. And it ain't going to happen. Like you're going to stay down at the bottom, and you're going to stay inhaled, and you're never going to move, right? So in comparison, so they'll lose force. However, from a structural standpoint, their capacity to turn is greater because of their physical structure. So they're very good at rotating relative to some other structure, which gives you an advantage. So the way that we produce velocity is by turning. And so if I'm a better turner, I have the potential to produce velocity to a greater degree, because they are at opposite ends of the force curve, right? It's like high force is slow, broad, like that's your, as we would say back in the olden days, the stocky archetype, right? As I move towards my narrow, again, my turning capabilities gives me mechanical advantages for turning. So that means that anything that requires either repetitive turns or like great velocity in turning, and all you have to do is think about the athletes that have to create the greatest degree of rotation. and then look at how they do it and to the degree that they do it. So if you took an Olympic diver that can perform twists, like how many short, stocky Olympic divers do you ever see? Not too many, right? They tend to be smallish because they got to turn really, really fast, and they tend to be narrow ISA archetypes because it enhances their ability to do so. Ice figure skaters, like I always picture the figure skater doing a spin at the end of every routine ends in the spin, so everybody can prove that they can do it. And you would never see like for some reason, Chris Farley pops into my head. It's like you would never see Chris Farley as a figure skater doing like high velocity spins. Right. Just because structurally it just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and if anyone wants to see it, you look. I forgot. I can't remember the guy's name off the top of my head. But you want to see the only guy that can do the quad axle, you will see the narrowest person I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah. Because
he can spin so fast.
He can compress himself and spin faster than everybody else because he can get really close to that. Like I can get really close to that longitudinal axis. The tighter I am to that axis, the faster I can spin. So that is a superpower in many aspects. You look at some of your better baseball pitchers. They're going to be structurally, they're going to have a very they tend to be taller, and then they can turn around that long axis better than others. Not all of them. Like there's people that can overcome certain things and still produce an outcome, but generally speaking, we have to look at it from the general perspective. The Olympics is always the best way to look at things because all of the best athletes in certain events all fall into the same structural archetype because it just selects itself for that activity. Like pole vaulters tend to be a certain structure, high jumpers tend to be a certain structure, sprinters tend to be a certain structure. Exceptions to the rule always, but they tend to fall in line with certain structures.
Yeah, if you need the ease of turning, if you need the acquiring of range of motion, large ranges of motion, if you need to keep your guts off of the ground more often and in a more frequent way. So like endurance runners, for instance, need this sort of narrow structural archetype because what they're trying to do is stay off of the ground, not necessarily put the force into the ground, because force involves spending time on the ground and pushing.
So the narrow helical archetype center of gravity is actually relatively higher in comparison to the others. So again, there's the other advantage, and again, that's a velocity based structural benefit.
Yeah, and being closer to the longitudinal axis also helps. Is that specifically what helps with like a pistoning effect or the efficiency of
if that's their structure? That's their structure, yes, because when you think about like internal dynamics and the way that your innards move, they're basically water. It's like it reduces, like there's more laminar flow, so it reduces the resistance to the internal dynamics. So like your marathon runners, that from an efficiency standpoint, you're going to see a structural bias towards the narrow helical archetype.
Right, because there's less resistance to that repeated motion, that pistoning effect of bouncing up and down across the ground. So they're not necessarily going to they're not going to be the fastest in a 10-meter race, but they will beat you in a mile every time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so now let's touch on the wide superpowers, the wide capabilities in contrast.
Yeah. Okay. So now you start to think it's like I have an exhalation bias. So right away we start thinking pressure. Right. We think about the diameter of the structure in and of itself. So if I have more surface area per unit of pressure, I can apply more force, and I can stack more weight. So like if you think about like a tall skinny pole versus a broad wide pillar as to what's going to hold more weight, right? I can support more weight on a much wider, heavier structured pillar. That's kind of what we're using as an extreme representation of a wide. So they tend to be more force producers. Again, I have to be able to push down into the ground more aggressively, right, with higher force. In my internal rotation bias allows me to do that. I have a wider base of support, generally speaking. Like I said, we have greater circumference, so the surface area of structure is greater. These are your force producers. By general design, If I have a broader perpendicular, I don't turn nearly as well. It doesn't mean I can't turn, it just means I don't turn nearly as well. So compare a wide receiver in American football with an offensive lineman. It's like the wide receiver has got to make a lot of changes direction, a lot of turns. And I wouldn't want that quality in an offensive lineman who has to protect a quarterback, because if an offensive lineman turns easily, he doesn't really have a job, because he's got to stop people from getting towards his quarterback, which means that if I turn like a door on a hinge, I'm not stopping anybody. So again, this is just looking at opposites of the spectrum. I have a low force producer, high velocity person at one end. I have a high force producer, lower velocity and less turning on the other end.
Yeah. In case people don't know that those are force and velocity sometimes get lumped together. Mm-hmm. People think that if I train hard, I lift heavy weights, my force and velocity will increase because they somehow are paired, but they are opposites.
The best way to state it is you cannot produce maximum force and maximum velocity at the same time. Right. That's why they're opposed.
Yeah.
It's not that like there has to be a force that produces velocity, right? Mm-hmm. Like there's an association there, but they're not the same. They're not the same thing. Right. And so if you say I can't like just think about maximums, you can't do them both at the same time, because maximum force requires time and velocity means I don't have a lot of time. Right?
Yeah.
So.
All right. And one is internal rotation, down stuck on the ground, yes. Stopping time. And the other one is external rotation, up, away, yes. Expanded, yes. Off the ground, high center of gravity. It's like these, and that's why these things are on a continuum. That's why this unified health and performance continuum exists. Like this model is based on these continuums and the coherence of all of these things.
Yes.
It's like the structure is the rotation, is the forces, is the velocities, is the spaces, is the center of gravity, is moving, all these things together.
Yes,
so
the constraints are the determinant of capacities.
Right. Okay. And so what we're going to do, since we've introduced the idea, we've defined it, we've talked about the types and what defines those types on the extremes of wide and narrow. That will be what we're going to wrap up with for this first part. We will be doing a second part where we're going to get into how to measure it and identify, and then how to train and treat these types. What sort of strategies you'll need to have for interventions or exercise or programming.